Fears of a longer, more protracted conflict in the Middle East are gripping the world's financial markets, sending stocks into a tailspin and energy prices soaring. Governments in Asia are moving fast to address the potential impact of rising oil prices on consumers and on businesses, as crude supplies from the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz come to a virtual standstill. Now, South Korea is imposing a domestic fuel price cap for the first time in nearly 30 years to contain the spike in prices, while the Chinese government has already directed major oil refiners to suspend diesel and gasoline exports and to prioritize domestic supply. And over in Japan, a lawmaker has said the government instructed a national oil reserve storage site to prepare for a possible release of crude. India may turn to Russian oil after the US temporarily eased sanctions to allow Russian crude stranded at sea to be sold. Bangladesh is rationing fuel, with motorists forming long queues at petrol stations. And Indonesia's motorists are in a more fortunate position, with the finance minister saying the government would absorb the shock from oil prices. And over in the Philippines, fuel price increases are being rolled out in stages, with the government warning of more hikes to come. And over in Thailand, the energy minister says the government will freeze cooking gas prices and that the government can manage the energy needs. Now, Malaysia, as an oil producer, stands in a less vulnerable position. That's according to an analyst speaking to our Malaysian correspondent, Melgo, a position underlined by the country's second finance minister.
As long as Malaysia is a net oil and gas producer, we're fine. I mean, we're much better protected than most people.
But what is your number one concern then?
Well, my one concern is how to remain steady in a world of craziness.
If this is not a prolonged issue, Malaysia has the capacity to withstand. Because we must remember that we started the year with a very strong base. GDP was 5.2% for the whole of last year. We start with a very high tailwind. And the first quarter numbers are still looking promising.
Despite those reassuring remarks from Malaysia, oil prices breaking through the psychological threshold of $100 a barrel does place pressure on many oil-dependent economies in Asia. CNA's Roland Lim looks at the region's exposure to this potential global shock.
If the Strait of Hormuz is the world's energy choke point, Asia is where the pressure lands first. Now, around 4/5 of crude and LNG moves through Hormuz, normally heads to Asian buyers. China, India, Japan and South Korea are the key destinations. Japan and South Korea are the most exposed. Japan gets around 75% of its oil and about 10 to 15% of its LNG by Hormuz. South Korea buys about 60% of its oil and 15 to 20% of its LNG from the Middle East, leaving both highly vulnerable. Now, in rough total energy terms, that's about a quarter of each country's energy system. India looks somewhat less exposed in percentage terms. About 50% of India's crude imports pass through Hormuz. Now, China is the least vulnerable of the four relative to its sheer size. Now, China gets about half of its oil imports from the Middle East. Beijing also has more fallback options than its neighbors. Russian and Central Asian gas pipelines, rising domestic gas production, coal, and the ability to cut spot LNG buying. The buffers for each country, meanwhile, look uneven. Now, Japan has the biggest formal oil cushion, about 254 days of consumption, including national and private stocks. South Korea says its combined stockpile covers about 208 days. Now, China's reserves are more opaque, although Reuters cites broader analyst estimates of around 900 million barrels, which work out to be about 3.5 months' worth of imports. India's official strategic petroleum reserves alone is only about 9.5 days, although total crude and product storage is much larger, of around 74 days. And the hard truth is, alternatives to fossil fuel are still limited. Oil and gas remains the mainstay energy source powering the global economy, despite the recent pivot to renewables and green energy sources that have yet to make an impact. So for Asia, the first line of defense is stockpiles, the second, rerouting, and then rationing. There's no substitute if the Strait of Hormuz stays shut for long.
For now, reserves and rerouting are softening the blow. But if tensions in the Middle East continue to disrupt flows through the Strait of Hormuz, there are no quick substitutes for these heavily relied upon energy supplies.